Recently, a number of celebrities that I don't particularly care about began attacking the idea of the fairy tale. That's not a new idea, it's been going on for a long time, but now it's getting some revived media attention, with actress Keira Knightley claiming that she has banned certain Disney films from her home and doesn't allow her daughters to watch them because they lack a progressive feminist narrative. These films include movies like Cinderella and The Little Mermaid, saying that they depict women without agency, and demanding that characters and her daughter alike rescue yourself, obviously, rather than wait for Prince Charming. Kristen Bell, voice of Anna from the movie Frozen, also spoke out about her objections to the 1937 classic film Snow White, depicting an unsolicited and non-consensual kiss scene. Of course, Snow White and Sleeping Beauty would have died had they not been rescued by their princes, but I suppose this is the kind of rape is the worst possible crime, worse than death notion? Except, it's not rape, it's a kiss. But okay, we agree. It was non-consensual. Further, feminist author Scarlett Curtis, and yeah, she looks as you would expect, added her 2 cents, whinging as another panelist on Good Morning Britain defended free speech and suggesting that all fairy tales need be rewritten, and despite claiming that all Disney princesses are thin, subservient white women who get whisked off their feet by white men, also called Disney's Aladdin racist cultural appropriation.
Actually, this is too outdated. We just shouldn't be using this anymore.
No, because then where's freedom of speech? What are we going to start? I mean, the whole thing is...
So which is it, love? They're all white women, but wait, one of them is brown and she shouldn't exist because she's problematic too? You gotta pick one or the other. Other articles, though, have come out lately lambasting fairy tales and encouraging parents to abandon them for their portrayal of marriage and family as a happy ending, including criticizing their use of traditional gender roles, with males as physically strong and females as a kind and relationship-oriented group of individuals, and holding women to unrealistic standards of beauty, such as not being morbidly obese. But is any of this true? Are fairy tales really potentially harmful to young girls' senses of the self, to their psychology? There's a lot to get into here, so let's begin at the beginning of any good origin story, right? Where do these romantic fairy tale tropes come from, and are they harmful? But first, let's look at the origin of the knight in shining armor and of the medieval romance. The late, great Dr. Joseph Campbell, arguably the leading scholar of comparative mythology, or comparative religions, posited the existence of what he called the monomyth in his description of the hero's journey, in which he found threads of woven into the tapestry of pretty much every single human culture. Similarly, he also found legends of romance and love, as much as trial and triumph across nearly every society that he investigated. Of course, for his clearly hateful thinking that he so eloquently expressed in his famous quote and life model, "Follow your bliss," Dr. Campbell has been labeled as a right-wing anti-Semitic racist, because who hasn't at this point? But putting that personal irritation of mine aside, Campbell describes the development of the mythology of courtly love and romance as representative in Tristan and Isolde. Now, many cultures have tales of gender roles and reproduction. For example, even the most basic Genesis tale of Adam and Eve is present in more ancient Mesopotamia and across the African continent. But the idea of love beyond just lust or necessity, Campbell contends, is a latter theme of human cultures. And that makes sense when we start to look at the history and development of human civilization. So first, let me take a moment to describe that development, and the societal differences between sex, love, and marriage in storytelling. As animals, obviously we seek to reproduce, so take what I'm about to say from a purely biological standpoint. Given the long gestation and exceptionally long period needed to raise our children to a point of self-sufficiency, humans are unquestionably a case-selected species according to the arcade selection theory of the biological sciences. However, behavioral norms can influence behavior just as evolutionary norms influence behavior, and not just in humans, but in many species. They tend to intermingle. It's evident in other case-selected species, such as wolves, who develop into pack societies. Thus, while we possess this long gestation and rearing necessity, we as animals also want to seek out the best genes to propagate. These are seemingly two opposing needs and desires. The females of our species can more or less choose to abort, albeit to great potential self-harm, but as such, females have become the selectors of reproduction and passing on of genetic material in the human species. You know, outside of some kind of insane, fictional Mad Max scenario, which is why you should stop using fiction to represent reality. But we came therefore to highly value women above men because of their value as genetic selectors. And this is evidenced by considerable amounts of research. But for example, here from Feldman Hall et al. 2016, in a series of studies, they found participants were far more likely to harm a man than a woman by saying they would throw them off of a footbridge, 88% male versus only 12% female, with only one of the 352 participants saying that they would save a man before a woman from a sinking ship. The sample generally reported that it was less acceptable to commit any act of harm against women, and viewed women as less tolerant of pain, although the actual data on that might be a little bit reversed. We can see, though, that women are perceived of as special, unique, fragile. They need to be placed on a pedestal, and there are evolutionary reasons for that. On one hand, women will want to reproduce with the man who possesses the best, highest, and tightest genes. But on the other hand, remember that human children take a lot of time and work to rear. More than a single parent can oft provide even today, but particularly so in early human tribal societies. Therefore, for the beneficence of offspring, all women cannot seek the top few peak men, meaning humans are better suited to pair bonding long term. But this pair bonding means a more one-to-one equal distribution of the sexes, and that is counter to the propagation of the best genetic material with the most women. Thus, we developed social norms such as monogamy and marriage, usually at least partially arranged over the past many centuries, that men who were oft less physically fit or attractive, but were, for example, more mentally astute, would therefore be able to mate with women in a more equal matching of the genders for the propagation and success of the human race and the maximalization of the welfare of human children. To facilitate this, for much of human history, marriage was a purely contractual agreement, and essentially non-consensual for any parties involved. The concept of love is a latter idea that derives from a fairly natural evolution of these societal norms, though, as resources became less scarce and society became more stable, in the idea that this thing called love, can transcend any other earthly obligation. Obviously, the biggest, buffest dude on the block should be the man desired by all women out of their genetic superiority to reproduce with. However, that alone is not conducive for the human species long term for all women to flock to a few men. So once we came over this period of more scarcity and had a little bit more breathing room, we could start to think about romance for romance's sake. Thus, first we developed monogamy, and then later we developed love. Although we've always had concepts of love, of course, parental love, familial love. But this idea of the fated romance comes later in human history. Well, it doesn't all happen in such easily defined periods. Dr. Lehman did a really cool video on this, I would suggest. But if we listen to Joseph Campbell, he seems to think that this romantic love idea is a much later contribution and addition to the Western mythos. But it's still a very ancient one. In the legend of Tristan and Isolde, an Irish princess is betrothed to marry King Mark of Cornwall, and his knight, Tristan, is sent to bring her to him. In some versions of the tale, she attempts to kill Tristan, and in others it's an accident. But regardless, they both drink from a poultice that is revealed to be a love potion. Despite being married to King Mark, for whom she professes her love, she and Tristan cannot contain their own undying love for one another, and they abscond together into legend. So many versions of the end of the tale that I cannot begin to encompass them here. Campbell again marks this tale, which originates somewhere in the vicinity of the 12th century in written form, but likely dates back an additional millennium at least in spoken lore, as the turning point in Western culture from the arranged marriage towards the marriage of heart and spirit, toward the concept of love. As such, we can look to the story as part of the groundwork for the generalized romantic fairy tale of the knight in shining armor. Other Arthurian tales mirror this sentiment, such as that of Arthur's own wife, Guinevere, who falls madly in love and flees Camelot with her beloved Sir Lancelot, who she engaged in extramarital relations with, despite knowing the great anguish and strife that would be caused by her betrayal. Thus, the origin of the Western romantic fairy tale and the courtly love legends indicates departure from the arranged marriage and toward a concept of romance as important, particularly in its involvement of the decision-making capacity of women. You could say, for sure, Sleeping Beauty was forced into her relationship with Prince Charming. He kissed her without her consent. But was she? After all, their meeting is one of chance in most versions of the legend, particularly the ones we tell today. She is not arranged or forced to wed him. It is her decision. Instead, what we see are actually quite negative depictions of arranged marriages. Despite both Guinevere and Isolde cheating on their husbands, most versions of those tales as well spare them from any kind of divine retribution or physical retribution, particularly in the case of Isolde, being withheld any justice due to the intervention of the love potion. Yet, here we see the knight come to save Milady from her miserable, or not so miserable actually in these cases, arranged marriages. We took this theme, put it in a pressure cooker for 1,000 or 2 or maybe 3,000 years depending on who you ask, and we produced the modern concept of love that you see in every single Disney film. Well, used to see maybe. The fated encounter and romance. So the question is, again, is this harmful? Is it psychologically damaging for little girls to want to be princesses and thereby also potentially, and likely, wives and mothers, to believe in this concept of courtly love? It sure seems that a lot of feminists, both scholars and general social activists, have a major problem with fairy tales influencing young women to be awaiting their true love, their knight in shining armor to whisk them away off into marital bliss, or, and I'm sure a more critical interpretation, into being miserable, barefoot, and pregnant. But do they have a point? So, let's look at the data first on marriage, family, gender roles, and happiness. Luhmann, Hoffman, Ide, and Lucas 2012 in a meta-analysis of 188 publications on the study of various life events, including marriage, with an N of almost 67,000 participants, found that marriage certainly did not negatively affect happiness on any of the factors assessed. While there was a slight increase in cognitive well-being in life satisfaction briefly before the marriage, this eventually returned to a normative level. However, affective, that is emotional well-being, remains static before and after marriage. Thus, we can see in the data the existence of a so-called honeymoon effect, or a period that raises happiness for a short term. Their data indicate more depressing findings when it comes to childbirth, forwarding that relationship satisfaction deteriorates over time after the birth of a child. However, general affective well-being with life increases with the birth of children. Thus, while having children may decrease relationship happiness, it increases overall life happiness and enjoyment and appreciation of one's life. The 2015 World Family Map project, conducted by the Institute of Family Studies under the scholarship of Scoot, Wilcox, Ryberg, and DeRose, examined long-term happiness and family trends internationally, and found that marriage played an important role in family well-being. Interestingly, several countries with more prevalent beliefs in the equal roles of men and women in contribution to household income also tended to be significantly lower in general family life satisfaction. For example, in China, 85% of respondents believed that women should contribute equally to men, yet only 32% of respondents reported being very satisfied with their family life. While in the United States, 65% reported a belief in equal contribution, and 67% reported being very satisfied with their family life. Further, when it comes to children, the results show that having a partner was consistently and significantly a deciding factor in parental happiness, much more so over division of labor between partners. As we can see here, in every region, every country assessed, single parenthood presents with the lowest level of reported happiness. While different divisions of labor were more or less related to greater or lesser happiness, the one consistent finding was that single parenthood indicated a greater propensity towards unhappiness. Mikuka, 2016, in a massive analysis of life satisfaction based on data from the World Values and European Values surveys, collected from 87 countries and more than 292,000 participants over 29 years, between 1981 and 2009, found that marriage served as an overall positive influence in the happiness across both genders in contrast to those who remained unmarried. The researchers found a similar honeymoon effect, with life satisfaction for men declining toward the norm of unmarried men over time, That is, older men became happier when they remained unmarried, but married men experienced greater happiness, only declining towards the mean over time. Women, in turn, reported generally consistent higher levels of satisfaction after being married, without that same decline reported by their male counterparts. However, the data indicate overall that married people of either sex tend to be more satisfied than the single. In further examination of the phenomena we saw present in that meta, Stardrova, Fechenhauer, and Schlosser sought to explain why it is often that cohabitating partners tend to report being less happy than married partners in an analysis of 22,000 participants from 30 countries, and identified it to be a trend across most nations, with an exception of a few outliers, such as Cyprus, where apparently it sucks to be a married woman. Considering it's the only country that was assessed in this, with a significant Muslim population, at least of the time of the sampling, it really wallops the old walnuts now, done it. But the finding of most interest to us today, probably, is in the impact of belief of traditional gender roles. While both men and women who live in nations with liberal gender roles reported higher general levels of satisfaction with their marriage and life, cohabitation in more socially liberal societies was only significantly improving the happiness of women in those societies, rather than in more traditional ones. That is, men and women are less happy overall when they are cohabitating rather than being married in general. But women's happiness in cohabitation does approach, though does not meet, that same level of happiness with being married only in societies where such behavior is seen as normative or acceptable. Argyll, 1999, in an overview chapter devoted to the topic in Foundations of Hedonic Psychology, states that marriage is one of the strongest correlates to happiness and well-being, including mental health. This being an older chapter, I'll only briefly discuss it, but it's worth mentioning. This table illustrates the mean levels of satisfaction from a 1990 study between people of various marital statuses, and finds married people of both sexes to be the happiest, even over those living as married. Lai and Bilblart's 1993 may provide some answers to some of the apparently conflicting data I've presented here. In an assessment of 13,000 respondents across men, for example, positive attitudes towards non-traditional family behaviors were positively related to feeling that they would be happier single, correlated at the level of 0.3, and similarly with women at 0.26. And although both men and women who supported non-traditional families reported their marriages were happy, that variable, having positive opinions towards non-traditional families, was positively correlated with spousal disagreements, reported marital strife, and an expectation that the marriage will eventually end, in both men and women. While happiness across egalitarian and traditional families was similar, and they actually reflected each other in many ways, with matched traditional versus egalitarian partners generally just having more positive outlooks than mismatched ones, matched traditional partners reported almost no trouble in their marriage over the last year and reported no expectation of the marriage ending. Vanash, Sveiskud, and Mathias, 2012, similarly in their analysis of the importance of beliefs about happiness and beliefs about traditional family values and satisfaction in marriage and child-rearing, found that the more people disapproved of non-traditional family styles, that is, single parents and blended households, the happier they were in general, and the more satisfied they were with their own family lives. This was similarly reflected in an individual's appreciation of parenthood and their happiness regarding having children. I know that sounds like a no-brainer, but it's important to note because it indicates why we might see some deviation in these massive swaths of data. If you want to be in a traditional marriage, and if you appreciate that kind of life, you tend to be happier in that marriage. If you want to be a parent, then having children is an emotional boon. However, if you don't want children, and don't believe in traditional marriage, you tend to be unhappy when placed into that position. So I ask, what exactly is wrong in believing in traditional roles and traditional marriage? This is the point of the potential harmful nature of the fairy tale, is it not? That somehow reading a fairy tale makes little girls want to have a married lifestyle. They want to have children, they want to be mothers and wives. But we find that people who want to be married and want to have children are happier as a result. It seems that believing in marriage and family has positive outcomes. I'm really not seeing the negatives here. But let's get into the media's involvement, right? Shapiro and Kroger were interested in examining the interaction of media portrayals of potentially unrealistic romantic relationships, because that's one of the major questions being raised, right? That this is unrealistic. And found that, you know what, there may in fact be some basis for the claims of Keira Knightley and others. However, hang on, we need to look at these data closely. The authors utilized the relationship's beliefs inventory, which defines dysfunctional beliefs regarding relationships as viewing disagreement as destructive, mind reading, that is anticipating one's partner should be able to understand your inner thoughts, that partners are incapable of change, that intercourse should always be perfect, and that these sexes are dimorphic. I take a little bit of umbrage with this instrument as being indicative of any type of relationship dysfunction, but let's look at what the researchers found using this instrumentation. Well, people who watch a lot of media did tend to believe more frequently in all of those supposedly dysfunctional relationship trends. So there we have it then, right folks? Maybe not so much. When we go into the regression analysis here, these tendencies are elucidated, with news being the most important factor of media at the level of 19.9 across all variables, and with romantic novels and comedy films falling far, far behind into second and third place at 6.3 and 5.1% of variance accounted for respectively. This doesn't even say anything about fairy tales. But if romantic novels, which is the closest you can get to that for adults, is at a 6.3 compared to a 19.9 variance accounted for versus the news, then it seems that fiction seems to be far less influential than reality, or at least perceived reality, on our stances and beliefs. And we've seen this through cultivation theory. Regardless, let's just say you're right anyway. Ignore the data. So looking specifically at romantic fantasies present in most fairy tales, or most of the ones that are being criticized, given we already know the minor effects about the belief in relationships this probably has, do these traditional gender role conforming stories affect women's self-perception? Well, again, it seems that the feminists are vindicated. Rudman and Hepman found that women who believe in a Prince Charming or other types of romantic myths possessed lower job status and had lower career aspirations than both other women and men, particularly when those beliefs were held internally, that is, implicitly. But is that necessarily a problem? Again, marriage and child rearing, having a family doesn't seem to be such a bad thing if you don't expect it to be. So is it possible that sane marriage and sane relationships are bad for women, is more detrimental when you hear it on the news every single day, you know, like we do right now? That's actually psychologically damaging to the long-term mental and relationship health of both men and women, but we'll put that aside. We still have a hell of a lot to go through. Maybe the problem then is something about women's attraction towards the dominance in men and the supposed reflection of the submissiveness of women. That's the real problem. That's hurtful, psychologically damaging. After all, as Wood 2009 identified, women who are involved in abusive relationships often use fairy tale and romantic fantasy narratives to describe the nature of their unhealthy, violent partnership. With his entire sample of 20 women in physically abusive relationships referencing at least once a belief in their partner as representative of Prince Charming. It is well documented that women find aggressiveness, or what we might often call masculinity, attractive. I made a video on exactly why women become infatuated with jihadis and bad boys, and explains it in more detail. But in brief, yes, on average and in aggregate, women like masculine men, and men like feminine women, although they're not completely turned off by more masculine women. But see Sedala Kenrick and Verschoor, 1987, for more information. And yes, I know that's an older citation, but attraction doesn't really change. The fact is, dominance and aggression, but not domineering, were related to increased female attraction towards men and enhanced their desirability as mates. It seems to me that Wood's research was describing women using fairy tales not because they were confused, but they were using them as a coping method for those extreme circumstances in which they were existing, and therefore does not typify the average relationship between men and women behaving in conformity of gender norms, with males as dominant and strong, and females as submissive or relationship-oriented. Let's look further into that though. Does conformity to gender norms of masculine and feminine have any negative effect on the psyche or the sense of self? Would, different one, Christensen, Hebel, and Rothberger, 1997, sought to provide an answer to this question and found that it lies pretty much, as many things, in self-consistency. Now, this study did something that I really can't abide as effective. That is, that the researchers asked participants to imagine themselves in certain social situations, either communal, being more loaded feminine, or dominant, being more loaded masculine, and consider how it would make them feel to interact. I have criticized every study I have ever cited that uses this type of methodology because it is absurdist intrinsically, but let's see what they found. The data forward that both men and women who viewed gender norms as important to their sense of self had a more positive response to the affiliated gender stimuli, but also that women in particular, regardless of the relevance of gender norms towards the self-concept, vastly preferred communal situations over dominant ones. That is, women were happier and more aroused by social contexts, but even more so when gender schema was important to them. Men who viewed gender norms as important to the self also rated dominant situations more favorably, but the means of good feelings and arousal were significantly lower across all variables for male ratings. But gender role norms are not the only criticism of the fairy tale. It goes far beyond social situations, in which, as I've shown, we do see some evidence that both men and women feel more comfortable in dominant and communal context respectively. There is also a wealth of literature on the importance of looking and feeling attractive as important to a woman's reported self-esteem. After all, a big criticism of fairy tales is not just those gender norms, but also on their emphasis on the importance of female appearance as beautiful. Although, it's not as if there were actually any morbidly obese fedora-tipping white knights in the legends, now are there, right? Well, we need evidence for everything. So Baker, Sperry, and Gower-Holtz coded words related to physical attractiveness across 168 fairy tales from the Brothers Grimm to assess the prevalence of words related to attractiveness and physical appearance to see if beauty was related to positive outcomes for characters. Unsurprisingly, women's appearance was, yes, mentioned far more frequently than men's, and specifically was mentioned in manners that described them as attractive or beautiful. Further, 31% of the tales associated beauty with goodness. So, there's the evidence. We see that this trend exists in fairy tales, but how does it potentially affect girls who are exposed to fairy tales that present the princess as beautiful? Well, many feminist scholars, including Curie in 1997, posit there is a significant psychological harm caused by exposure to unrealistic standards of beauty, noting how most of her teenage subjects associated looking good with feeling good. Grosch, Levine, and Mernon, 2001, in a meta-analytic review of 25 studies, examined the effect of exposure to thin women on self-perception and found consistently that exposure to thin models in media had a negative effect on body image in relationship to the control conditions, particularly in individuals under 20. Now, the post-hoc analysis actually indicated that this effect shrank the more one was exposed to media, but hey, that's still awful, right? An overall effect size of negative 0.3 to exposure to media? It's not huge, but it's still troublesome. See, exposure to media that emphasizes beauty is hurting young girls. Ban the fairy tale with its description of the beautiful princess. But wait, this study has been cited over 1,000, reaching 2,000 times. Do we find this result because they are female or because they are young? See, that meta looked at both male and female participants, and a further study by Vanderberg et al. 2010 of 4,600 adolescents found that there was statistically no significant difference between boys and girls who possessed body image issues and reported levels of self-esteem when accounting for weight, actual weight, race, and social economic status, as well as age. So no, body image issues and self-esteem problems that arise from media exposure seemingly affect girls and boys equally. Regardless, we still see plenty of anecdotes about the harm caused by media exposure to girls uniquely. And it is true that women are considerably more likely than men to develop eating disorders and to undergo plastic surgery. But why? If body image and self-esteem are unrelated to gender in the age range where this seems to matter, the teens, Why is it so important for girls only, seemingly? Well, it is true that women are almost solely the target for beauty products, in terms of marketing. But again, why? Let's for a second look away from the easier social constructs and back to evolution for a bit. Early human males conducted the heavy lifting, literally and figuratively, while for women, competition in the sexual marketplace was not so much about evidencing oneself as worth, be it through skill as a hunter or as an artist. As I said, women were the selectors of gene reproduction, and as such for women in this pre-civilized environment, it was mostly, if not purely, about looks. While men competed for access to mating through labor, women competed with each other through appearance in order to obtain the best male mate. I'm pointing out this evolutionary nature of this divergent set of mating habits because it is observable in the ubiquity of women's concern about their physical appearance across various cultures across the globe. For example, data collected from the Dove Real Beauty campaign indicated 90% of girls between ages of 15 and 64 across 10 different countries, including the US, Canada, Britain, Italy, France, Portugal, the Netherlands, Brazil, Argentina, and Japan, were unhappy with at least one aspect of their physical appearance, and with most women describing themselves as average or natural, encompassing 56% of the sample, and only 2% describing themselves as beautiful. Shocking, right? But hang on, think about it. Most women think they are normal, and they wish they were more attractive, yeah? Is that indicative of low self-esteem? Or is that indicative of realistic self-esteem? Other descriptors, including attractive, feminine, good-looking, cute, and pretty, were reported less commonly, yes. But all of those positive terms comprised another 36% of responses. What is this ratio starting to remind me of? I remember. Could it be a normal curve? This survey intentionally did not provide any negatively skewed items and threw away any questioning ones or people who said that these descriptors did not depict them. So I can only speculate, but I would imagine that this would turn very quickly into a normal distribution, with about 13.6% of women saying, I am below average or plain or something similar to that, and something like 2.2% reporting themselves to be truly ugly. See, this is why it's important to look at data closely, because the way these data were reported on seemingly every news article, and even academic articles that I've seen mentioned it, phrases it as, study finds 2% of women think they are beautiful. Only 2%! Well, friends, did you ever stop to consider that maybe only 2% of women really are beautiful, stunning, or gorgeous? Just like probably only 2% of women are absolute dogs? Wanting to be pretty is present in every country assessed because it's part of the female gender's evolutionary profile, and wanting to be attractive is an important part of human society in general. We'll get into that. Everyone wants to be attractive, and it's not just in the prevalence across countries, it is in women's behavior towards other women and men alike. We've all heard the claim that harmful beauty standards are detrimental to young girls. They hurt self-esteem. But if that's true, then why are the general reported levels of self-esteem, according to this meta-analysis of 212 studies with 97,000 participants of all ages conducted by Kling, Hyde, Showers, and Bushwell in 1999, indicating that women's average self-esteem is only lower than that of men at the level of 0.21. When you look at the age differences, this completely falls apart even on its face. It is not prominent in early childhood when one might read fairy tales, for example. And yes, during that age there is a difference, but it fails to reach statistical significance. It is only statistically significant in the early to mid-teen age range. Over 60, it begins to even move in the reverse direction. McMullen and Kearney 2004 found that being female had no direct effect on self-esteem across all of the age ranges they assessed, when being single and poor were accounted for as variables. What the fresh heck's going on in that 11 to 22 age range then, where we do see that small deviation? That's right, puberty. Girls want senpai to notice them, and as is normal for our sexually dimorphic species, evolving this way and building social mores around it so they wear makeup, do their hair, and try to look beautiful to attract a mate. But hence, that's why women are often the harshest judges of the appearance of other women, because they are competing for the best, most attractive, most successful males with what they bring to the table, and that is physically. Does that mean women can only be pretty? Of course not. But simply that it is a normal part of human mating behavior to engage in these kinds of patterns. And that a lot of women like feeling pretty. Even if we were to just abandon my entire evolutionary rationale, why wouldn't one want to be attractive? Why wouldn't a woman want to be pretty? For example, Dellinger and Williams 1997 conducted 20 in-depth interviews with various employed women and found that most of them talked with their female co-workers about uses of makeup and clothing, typically giving or receiving advice. Oh, and that friendly advice? Yeah, that's not in no way used for social dominance. No, of course it isn't. Except, yes, it absolutely is. And we can find it described and illustrated in White's 2001, who interviewed multiple women as well, and found that women intentionally styled their hair in order to get attention, both from men and women consistently across pretty much everyone she interviewed, and even found one participant noting that having a good hair day gave her power over men. Several women from the Dellinger and Williams report said that when they chose not to wear makeup or forgot to put it on, their female co-workers would ask if they were ill. "Are you doing okay, Barbara?" Women judge each other more harshly even on the possession of body hair than men do, as reported by Tiegman and Lewis 2004. Specifically, women were significantly more disgusted by other women with excess body hair than men were. In the Dellinger and Williams data, one woman said wearing makeup made her feel energetic. Several said it made them feel more professional, and multiple women said it actually made them feel more comfortable and secure in their own skin. Women want to engage in these kinds of behaviors of feeling pretty actively. They are not being blindly forced into it. Kathy Davis, in her book, Reshaping the Female Body, 1991, interviewed Dutch cosmetic surgery patients over a prolonged period of time and found that women had not been tricked into their decision to undergo these procedures by advertising or beauty standards, that they were extremely well informed and pursued that cosmetic surgery so that they could regain a sense of control over their lives, so they could feel normal or even powerful. And why wouldn't they feel happier when they feel prettier? Because, in some senses, pretty really is power. Attractive people are subject to something called the halo effect. And there's tons of research on this, but as an overview, pretty people are typically more likely to be successful, wealthier, attain a higher degree of education, be well-liked, and perceived as persuasive. More attractive women are more likely to get married and marry men of higher social economic status. Remember those two things I said really affected self-esteem over gender, single status, and wealth? It's not that people who are beautiful are inherently somehow better, obviously. But if socially we treat them better, particularly because pretty women have a high value in the sexual marketplace, then is there a functional difference? We view attractive men this way too. And more importantly though, what's the problem when women appear to like it themselves? Well, I would guess it's because it means that yes, there is a hierarchy in human mating, and despite still being the deciding gender in reproduction, women who are less attractive have less power over men than attractive ones, and less power over other women as well. This is what feminist scholars have actually decided to call benevolent sexism, but you might have heard of it under the term chivalry. And likely to the chagrin of many of these scholars, other women like that too. Becker 2010 found that women who weren't feminists don't have a problem with benevolent sexism, that is, believing positive things about women. Maybe that's because women who aren't feminists tend to not look like, feminists. In fact, female participants were more likely to endorse hostile sexism towards feminists and career women. More interestingly though, at least to me, priming with mentions of feminism and working women had the greatest effect on women who express, that is, that women who do not hold sexist beliefs were more negative towards feminists when they were primed. In contrast, endorsement of benevolent sexism was associated only with thinking about housewives, and was unrelated to negative opinions towards women in general. If the goal is to even the sexual playing field, which I think we can see some clear evidence it is in the feminist movement with its emphasis on body positivity, for example, obviously, women who don't have a problem with chivalry of benevolent sexism are a problem. Not only because of what I've cited above, but as Barreto, Elmers, Pebinga, and Moya 2010 found, women who are exposed to benevolent sexism thinking positive things about themselves as women, in this case depicting women as pure and caregivers, were more likely to describe themselves as relational rather than task-oriented and leadership-driven, and were more concerned with their physical appearance. In other words, more traditional gender roles. Perhaps a more pressing concern for feminists is the effect that this has on the support of feminism directly. Looking at data from Becker and Wright 2011, women who were on the receiving end of benevolent sexism, which again the data show participants liked receiving, and looking at the relationship with positive affect, good feelings, both directly and indirectly, through perceived advantages of being a woman, were less likely to support a feminist cause. In their second study, this was even more evident as women who were exposed to benevolent sexism of chivalry were considerably less likely to sign a petition for women's causes or take up a flyer about the wage gap. Further, and connecting this back to fairy tales, sorry I've been going off, our Rudman and Hepman 2010 study found both men and women who implicitly had positive attitudes towards traditional gender roles in romantic fairy tales were less, quote, aware of sexism and were more approving of men caring for women financially as benefactors. And here it is, lads. This, I think I have uncovered, is the real issue with girls wanting to be beautiful fairy princesses. It's because by conforming to gender norms, which have evolutionary psychological bases, as they do social ones, means in the current, more egalitarian, post-arranged marriage cultural gestalt, which embraces the idea of love in its literature and fiction, means a diminished social marketplace value for women who are not beautiful, for women who do not conform to gender norms. In other words, as women gained more rights to freely choose a husband, and as the idea of love for love's sake over the idea of love for necessity of relationships and child rearing, the importance of female beauty was itself increased. Dowries became a thing of the past, and so all that was left was for women to look attractive. That means women who aren't pretty are lower on the totem pole, and less likely to receive the benefits of that benevolent sexism, or chivalry, whatever you want to call it. Thus, the seeming attempt to destroy cultural artifacts like fairy tales is evident, although you started the fire. And in fact, though, we can see evidence of this. Baker-Sperry and Gauerholtz found precisely that the year of publication affected the prevalence of female beauty descriptors, they being less common in older fairy tales than in more recent ones. Yes, it seems that women's liberation to a right to choose her partner was a major factor that forced women to compete more heavily to being the most beautiful, internally or externally. That's why Kristen Bell, herself a very pretty lady, reads her daughters a story about a monkey who is an asshole, even after other animals tried to help him not be an asshole, rather than a story about Snow White. I'm not just basically here calling feminists all ugly, obese, blue hairs who are jealous. I'm saying the data are consistent on this. As Rudman and Fairchild 2007 illustrate, a photo of an attractive female was negatively, both directly and indirectly, through perceived sex appeal correlated with anticipation she was a feminist. And moreover, women's self-identification as attractive or pretty was similarly negatively correlated with identifying as a feminist or holding feminist attitudes. Further, a key factor they identified in this is the perception of an inherent conflict between feminism and romance across both men and women, which was similarly reflected in belief in social conflict. That is, that men and women are different intrinsically and are better at different things. traditional gender roles are bad for recruiting support for the cause. In other words, women who believe in traditional gender roles don't seem to gel well with the feminist goal of equalizing the sexual marketplace. Interestingly enough, in large part due to women's liberation in sexual selection. But the claims made by pundits and scholars alike that wearing makeup and conforming to these roles is harmful just does not seem to be backed up even by their own data and research, without the necessity to define new terms like benevolent sexism. And if all of the data I have outlined today have not convinced you in any way, and I do want you to make up your own mind, I'll just let this bedroom feminist's emotional response to an article called, quote, "Men prefer debt-free virgins without tattoos," play in the background as I wrap up. Fairy tales are not problematic because they have any particularly negative impact on women's lives or psychology, at least not from the data that I have looked at. Beauty standards do not produce a female population that is overwhelmingly lower in self-esteem outside of a minor discrepancy during the horny teenage years than men. Marriages are still successful, often happy if stressful, but particularly seemingly strong in traditional families. And it seems evident through the data that women enjoy romantic fantasies, chivalry, and being appreciated as beautiful. Because, well, everyone does, right? We all want to be attractive and beautiful, and we all want to be loved. Duh! No, friends, fairy tales are problematic because if the media does have any effect on us, and it can to some degree, there's significant research on that, it's because that media, these fairy tales, reinforce constructs that are not antithetical to women, but are antithetical to feminist social agenda of women to not be mothers, to not be wives, to not be caretakers, who care about their appearance and who care about their husbands, who have a happy familial life. It's more about bringing women down to a similar level of dissatisfaction with their relationships with their opposite gender, and often human relationships in general. And the fact is, yes, life is inherently unfair, and that means human relationships are often inherently unfair. Not everyone is born as a Mary Sue or Gary Stu Ubermensch. Some people are just more and more beautiful and therefore more likely to succeed than others. And I'm sorry for that, but you cannot force equality of outcome by dragging everyone down into the mud with you. There is nothing about reading an occasional fairy story of love and chivalry that will permanently damage a girl's psyche from the evidence and data I have seen. But it might, just might, make her a little bit lean more conservative in her beliefs. And that's something I'll be covering in the second video on this series, in Understanding the Fairy Tale, where I discuss belief in a just world. That, though, friends, is the real problem, I think. Not for concern of the mental health of women and girls, but a political agenda. But what do you think? Thus for now, I leave you asking, mirror, mirror on the wall, what's the objective of this all? Is it the castigation of concepts of feminine beauty and gender roles? One that raises real problems or questions about the concept of the happily ever after? Or one which comes from greed to possess the beauty and bounties of others, either internally or externally? Tell me in the comments, and with that, for now, dear friends, this is the end. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Untitled.